Hi, everybody. Thanks for joining us for another edition of Hold My Drink, where we navigate the news and politics with a chaser of civility. I'm your host, Jen, inviting you to grab your favorite beverage, sit back, and imagine with us how to create a new American identity together. Welcome to another week of Hold My Drink. My co host this week is Ilana Redstone, a professor of sociology at the University of Illinois and the founder of Diverse Perspectives Consulting. She is also the creator of Beyond Bigots and Snowflakes, the video series on YouTube, and the author of the book Unassailable Ideas: How Unwritten Rules and Social Media Shape Discourse in American Higher Education. And in today's podcast, we're going to discuss the failure of diversity training and how and why we fail to communicate across political and ideological divides on sensitive and controversial issues, including those that touch on race and identity. Well, you know what my first question is, what are you drinking today?
I am drinking a very exciting glass of water. So
That's so much
very
better than me. It's I'm experimenting with hot toddies these days. It's like it feels like that's the season, right?
right. So what makes something a hot toddy? Just that it's hot and it has liquor in it?
Well, I a hot toddy is whiskey and tea,
Oh, okay. I
and
didn't
so
know it was
I'm
an actual thing.
yeah, well, I think it is, but yeah.
Okay, no, you're probably right.
So Jameson is the whiskey of choice. That's I'm testing that out. So
Nice, nice. Okay,
now,
good.
before I ask you a few questions, I was laughing. On our last conversation, we were talking about our Zoom etiquette, and how we usually our bottoms are still in our sweats or, our PJs even. And true today, I'm in my leggings. I have a little top on, but I think it's so funny because like nowadays, if I go out and I'm wearing pants with a zipper,
Yeah,
my family's like, "Ooh, what are
I
you
know.
gonna do?"
What
And
are
I'm
you
like,
getting dressed up for?
yeah. Who knew like the new fancy was pants with a zipper? But
I
then I
know.
started thinking, what was it in the 80s when mullets were cool? Wasn't it the
Yeah,
80s? Yeah, okay.
yeah.
So do you remember there was a saying that business up
Business
front,
up front.
party
Yeah,
in the
party.
back?
Right,
That's how I feel about our new Zoom etiquette. It's like business up
right,
here,
right. And then it's
party
just
down here.
sweatpants and slippers down below. Yeah. No, that's true. It is the Zoom version of a mullet.
It's the Zoom mullet, and I don't know that I can get. I mean, I'm kind of liking the Zoom mullet. I don't know what's going to
It's
happen.
very comfortable. It's very comfortable. Yeah.
Anyways, so to today's podcast, Ilana, you've written so much on diversity training and kind of the failure of diversity training. And I mean, my big question for you is, where do you think we are failing and what can we be doing better to have these really difficult conversations? I feel from my own experience, which I'll share in a bit, my own experience
Yeah.
is it hasn't we've created more division. So what do you see is happening? Where are we going wrong and what can we be doing about it?
I think that, I mean, obviously, there's a lot of room for improvement here. With respect to diversity programming in particular, I think, and so I've written, as I'm sure you know, so I've written a bunch of on this, particularly for as a contributing writer for Forbes. And, the latest piece that I did a two-part series where I talked about really the sort of the assumptions that underpin a lot of traditional diversity training, and they include assumptions about intent and assumptions about seeing and understanding the world through the lens of race and identity. But I think that the biggest point or the most salient point that I tried to make in the last one was that this idea that, when interactions go sideways, that it's ignorance or it's a lack of information that makes people disagree about things. So, and what I said in the article is that, this works to a certain extent, right? That assumption works, but it also implies that if we all had the same information, we'd all agree. And obviously, once you put it in those terms, everyone's like, oh, yeah, no, that's not true. Like, people get it. They're sort of, of course, we wouldn't all agree. But the assumption is just that, you know, So with the where does let me I could just clarify that a little bit. So where it does work are things like, oh, I didn't realize that it could be offensive to somebody to say, you don't look American, right? Okay, well, I didn't, maybe there's somebody who's like, I didn't realize, oh, now I understand how that could be offensive. Like, what does it mean to be American? And why does it mean you have to be white? And right. So that could be a legitimate example of ignorance, for instance. But there are other, the myth of the meritocracy is the one that always comes up, right? This is I think the most qualified person should get the job. Some person saying that, there is no amount of information that you're going to share with them that's going to get them to agree that this is an offensive statement. Like, they will understand why somebody else thinks it's offensive, but they're not going to agree that it should be something that's off the table. And so there's this whole range of things that people that where interactions can get tense, and the assumption, and I'll stop in a minute, the assumption that if we just told them, right? If we just It's just that they don't know the history, or they don't know the feelings of like, yeah, sometimes that works, but there's this whole range of issues where it's not going to work. And that's the piece that we have really kind of sucked at dealing with. And so, I have thoughts about, make some suggestions about how to do that, but I'll stop there. But those are some general thoughts.
Yeah, I mean, what I would love to hear a little bit more of the range of the issues. I'll tell you my experience, and maybe you can
Yeah.
talk to where you see that we could have done it differently. But
Yeah.
I believe so uh, deeply in equity, and I wanted to do a diversity training. I wanted to see what it was about, and I was under the impression that this would be an opportunity for me to hear other voices and to generate better empathy, more understanding, etc. And I was so looking forward to that, and I recognized that was going to be a place that would probably make me feel uncomfortable, and I'm comfortable feeling uncomfortable. I think that that's a good place to be. But what it ended up being about was, it was really a 2-day seminar on what is wrong with white people.
Hmm.
And so, it did the whole diversity training where we had to, and I read your pieces on diversity training, which I'll drop into our podcast notes as well for other people. But, we did the lining up to see who had the highest privilege scores and everything.
Oh, really? Okay.
Mhm.
I didn't know how, I heard someone else tell me
Yeah.
about doing that. I didn't know how common it was. So now you're the second person I've heard talk about doing that. Go ahead. I'm sorry.
I don't know. No, please interrupt whenever. I don't know. I mean, I've only been to one, but
Yep.
from what I've heard, that's pretty common, and it happened to be one that we did. And so that happened on the first day. It was a 2-day, full day
Right.
training, and so we lined up, and it was kind of like we were standing there in the line, and most of the people at the training were, I'd say, 85% were white,
Hmm.
and 15%, maybe even less, were people of color. And so it was like, shocker, white people. I mean, it was just like you knew what was going to happen, right?
Right.
But the
Right.
but the trainer made it very, very dramatic. So he's like,
Okay.
line up with your numbers on your chest and don't say a word. So it was like, so all you could hear, people like looking down the line, and some people started crying and whatnot, and I was kind of like, well, I knew this was, I expected what I was
Right.
going to see in the lineup, right? So while it was dramatic, it wasn't something where I was like, oh wow, shocker.
Mhm.
But here's the part, and then I'll hush. Is
Yeah.
after that, we were then assigned affinity groups, and our affinity groups were based on our white privilege number. So for the rest of the training, I found myself in a group of other white people, and a lot of the training was, we were assigned a task to, like, basically lay out white sins, as a group of white people. So we're all like, there's everyone's trying to, like, kind of one up each other. Oh, violent and rape, and I mean things as far as, like, even civility, that was considered a white person's thing. And so
Right.
it created more division. Not only was I sitting here with a bunch of white people, which I have no problem with, that wasn't what I was expecting, but I
Right.
wasn't hearing from other people where I could gain that empathy and that understanding and go, oh hey, I really had no idea. I ended up
Right.
just walking away feeling like kind of disgruntled with the fact that I was forced to highlight the evils of white people throughout history, which there are plenty.
Right.
But it didn't make
Right.
me feel any, more understanding of how we can come together across this divide.
Right. No, I think that's right. I mean, it sounds, yeah, I mean, it sounds like at least you had the opportunity to sort of reflect on the experience. Um, there's so much there with that whole approach. On the one hand, like if white privilege were if the sole point of white privilege were, for instance, to get people to recognize this broader idea of unearned advantage, right? Like which is clearly real, right? Like this idea,
Mhm.
that we have, and that some of that is based on skin tone, that there is unearned advantage. There are, and I'm not trying to present these as equivalents, there are other types of unearned advantage as well in terms of, just attractiveness advantage or, height advantage for me. Like, and again, I'm not trying to put them all on the same level. But that, thinking just about the idea of unearned advantage, that seems like something we should be thinking about, right? Like we should, like, how do we account for that? How do we think about those things? It was interesting. I was listening to a podcast one time where they were talking about this idea of luck and sort of unearned privilege or advantage or whatever. And they were using the example of LeBron James. And they were talking about, obviously he is just, a gifted athlete, et cetera. But the person, I'm blanking on the person's name, but they were talking about how it wasn't just that he's a gifted athlete. Like, so there was that layer of luck to it. But there was, and then, you could say, well, is he also just lucky to have the internal motivation and drive to make the use of his gifts? Is that also luck? And then and then you could say, well, is he also lucky that he's born in a time when we really value basketball skills, right? Like he could have been born during the Renaissance or something, like, where they probably wouldn't care if he was good at basketball. And so there's all of these, like, how do we think about those? Those seem like reasonable questions to ask to me, but this idea that from the training that you went through, that race and ethnicity is the most important thing about us always.
Mhm.
That you can't have any sort of transcendent experience that as you saw and you pointed out, that brings people together. Like there's nothing, I can't understand you, you can't understand me, there's nothing that can bridge that divide. That's not a helpful message. It's not a helpful message. I mean, really, it's not a a message at a societal level, and it's certainly not a helpful message in a workplace. Like, I don't know how is that, how anyone thinks that that's useful is a complete mystery to me. Um, and I think that, yeah, I mean, there are also these ideas of, you sort of touch on these ideas of collective guilt and I mean, that gets in there too. So it just turns into a bit of a muddle. Like you take this one thing, this idea of let's think about unearned advantage, of which white, skin color is clearly a big part of that story. And then it becomes this thing that says, okay, it's now the most important thing and it's the
Right.
only thing and et cetera. So
Yeah.
yeah, and that's not, it's not, I mean, not helpful is probably an understatement. It's counterproductive, really.
That's what I would say too. It creates more division, and I think studies have shown, and you've written about it. Diversity training often has the opposite effect of what we
Studies, but
want
you're
to
I've
happen.
cited studies that have done
Yeah,
that. Yeah, yeah.
yeah.
No, you're right.
So what I mean, because it is important that we address some of these things, like you said. I mean, unearned privilege is important that we address our history honestly.
Right.
Uh, how do we do that? Well, if you were to design a diversity training class, and you teach bigots and snowflakes, so maybe you can just give us an example. Maybe this is what you're doing. How would we find that acceptance while also exploring together uncomfortable truths?
I think that part of it is, so one of the things, so what I try and do really is just get people to think about questions. And sometimes what I'll tell people is that I don't really have answers. I just have lots of questions. So, and I'm happy to share my questions with you because I do think that recognizing some of the questions that we have and really sort of a core level of humility about what it is that we don't know and what it is that we don't know about how the world works and how things and how we know what we think we know and what does it mean to get it wrong, and these kinds of questions, I think, is something that should be factored in. So, for example, so to a diversity training, you know, talk about some of these issues that come up, but have a what I would say everyone talks about. Well, we have to really talk about race. And we have to have this frank discussion. Okay, but how about the frank discussion that says, well, how much does intent matter? Like, does it intent is clearly not a get out of jail free card, but it's also not irrelevant, right? And so how much should it matter? I think I used this example in the most recent article that I wrote. For instance, if you have two people sitting at a meeting, or I mean, let's say it's a meeting with a number of other people, and you have two people in it, and one is Latino and one is white. Let's say they're, just for the sake of argument, they're both men, and the white guy interrupts the Latino guy while he's talking. You know, did he do it because the guy is Latino and he felt like he just, his words were more important than the other guys, in the white person? Maybe. I I have no idea. Like, in the absence of any other information about that person, is that the assumption that we should make? What if we're wrong? And so how do you think about those things? And I would suggest also just being really clear about the assumptions that sit underneath about how we think. Again, so I mentioned intent, how we think about identity, how we think about how we define who we are, all of these things that sort of sit underneath this more conventional way of approaching diversity. And just say, look, like, there's also, we're not all going to be on the same page here. There are going to be people who think, even when we all have the same information, that we they still oppose affirmative action, right? Like, for example, or they still think that the most qualified person should get the job. And that's going to be a difference. So recognizing that there are going to be that people of reasonable minds can disagree on those things, and to be fair, I don't mean to suggest that that's not hard. Like, so for instance, and this is again something that I've talked to students about a lot, is if all you know about a person, for instance, is that they oppose affirmative action, and I use that as an example because it's everybody sort of knows instantly what we're talking about. If all you know about that person, it is entirely possible that they may take that position because they harbor some deep racial hostility, right? It's almost certain that people who are racist, according to some traditional definition, are going to be opposed to affirmative action, right? So that's certainly possible. It's also possible that they could oppose affirmative action for any number of other reasons, right? Including, they just don't think it's a policy that actually is helpful to to the members of the groups, the targeted groups. So, or some other, or whatever the other reasons are. And if you don't know anything else about the person, what assumption are you going to make? Are you going to assume that it's because they're racist, right? You don't know. All you know is their position. What again? So that question of what's the assumption that you're going to make? What does it mean to get it wrong? What kind of climate are you going to create? What does it mean when you get it wrong repeatedly? And what does that mean, for a society? What does it mean? Again, it's sort of a different question. What does it mean for a workplace? In terms of the climate that you're trying to create. What I would say for diversity trainings is some kind of explicit recognition of those aspects. I mean, which is why a lot of what I do is sort of almost a complement to that. I mean, yeah, I mean, that's how I see it. I realize other people may not see it that way, but that's how I choose to look at it.
I think you said something really interesting. I wanted to circle back to make
Yeah.
sure I understood on intent. And you gave the
Mhm.
example of the white guy and the Latino guy, and how, I think one of the other problems with diversity training is that there's this kind of this mantra as intent doesn't matter,
Right.
right? So again, if you were to give your example, if the white guy was just a jerk,
Sure.
or
An asshole. Right.
yeah, he's just being an asshole, and that's just his personality, and he's that way to anyone that he speaks to.
Right.
Then to automatically assume and put these assumptions on people that the intent still was racist, right? I
Mhm.
mean, and can you? I don't know if I'm describing it right. Can you give a little bit more on this idea of intent? Because I think that that's a major idea
Yeah.
behind a lot
Right.
of the discussion, is that your intent doesn't matter. if it
Yep.
ended up being racist, it was racist. So if
Yeah.
explain that a little
Right.
more.
Yeah, and just to go back to my hypothetical again, it could be also, just to be totally fair, it could be that the
Mhm,
guy
mhm.
neither racist nor an asshole and just wasn't paying attention, and with one, side conversation, pulling the person aside saying, look, you did this and it's really not okay and whatever, like then it would never happen, who knows. But the idea that intent doesn't matter, yeah, there are people who will take the position that the idea that intent doesn't matter, and in fact invoking the importance of intent is merely a way to sort of soothe white people's guilt, and it's nothing more than that. And to those people, I'm not sure that anything I say is going to land. Right, so I'm certainly aware of that. There's some people where there's nothing I'm going to say that's going to land. What I would say, to people who are wanting to kind of talk more about that, what I would say is, how can you have a society where intent doesn't matter? Like, how can you, you could loop back to a question of, for instance, is it possible for a person to be too sensitive? Just period, like, or question mark. Is it possible? Could such a person exist? And usually, every once in a while, I'll get someone who wants to say no. In which case, there's a separate response to that. But most people will say yes. Like they're like, yeah, I think it probably is possible. And so then and this is what I'm saying. Like, I don't have answers. I just have questions. All right. Well, what does that mean? If someone can be too sensitive, then you can't use offense as a way of discerning what's inside the boundaries and what's outside the boundaries. And so you're going to be stuck having to figure this out, having to navigate this space. And so figuring out a way to have those conversations in a way that's helpful. I think, and again, I said this in the most recent article, but there are two ways to avoid this problem. And nobody does either of them because they both suck, frankly. One is, you could have speech codes, right? Like, where you could have a workplace that has, if you want everybody on the same page, you could have, and it could be, updated daily or whatever, however, with whatever frequency to keep up with the way things change. This is in the acceptable column, this is in the unacceptable column. It could be written down and everybody could be on the same page. Everybody would have a shared understanding of what is okay and what is not okay. Nobody does that, right? This is sort of an authoritarian, very controlling kind of environment. No employer, and again, I'm talking about the workplace again, no one's going to do it. The other thing you could do is you could hire based on, you could explicitly name an ethos of the company that says, here at company X, like, intent doesn't matter in terms of our personnel interactions. Impact is the only thing that matters. If somebody says that they're offended, then we start from that. That's our starting place always. And then you could hire based on people who agree with that statement. Now, again, you're going to end up right in some space where there's just complete groupthink, right? Which is basically going to, no organization, no workplace wants that. So you have speech codes and you have selective hiring based on compliance or an agreement to comply with a sort of particular ethos. No company and rightfully so, no company wants to do either of those things. And so given that, you're going to have to figure out a way how to navigate this space, how to have these conversations. You can't, so intent is not off the table. Intent has a role here. It's not everything, but it's not nothing. And you cannot let people's feelings only run the show. So that's part, so that's, I think, yeah, I'm not sure if I answered your question, but that's sort of the idea.
Yeah, yeah. And I think, talking about the workplace and whatnot, it starts,
Yeah.
I love what you're doing because it
Mhm.
starts
Thank
with our kids and it starts with our kids in college to be able to grow into a workplace where they can have conversations and they feel comfortable asking uncomfortable questions or feeling uncomfortable themselves. And I feel that we have created, and I guess this is kind of leads to my last question for you, since you are in
Yeah,
the education space and the university space. I feel that there are many times that the university is not, they're so afraid of offense that they're
yeah,
not allowing these open questions, and these open questions shouldn't, they should be in in an environment like your classes are, where you're there to kind of have these conversations and to navigate them together. but we're so afraid to even have these conversations in a classroom setting to teach our kids to ask these important questions because we're so afraid of offense. And there's been numerous stories of, outbreaks of, people shouting down other people and whatnot for what was seen as offensive. And so
Mhm,
I really think it starts with classes like yours.
mhm.
Do you agree with my assessment that the university system has not done the best job of teaching our kids how to have these difficult conversations? And if you do agree with it, how do we promote what you're doing so that it becomes the norm with
Mhm.
our kids? Because it starts with our kids. We can't even talk about the workplace until
Right.
we start teaching our kids it's okay to ask a question in good
Right.
faith, of course, and
Mhm,
say and to be corrected in good faith,
mhm.
not be labeled as, a racist or a homophobe. I didn't This is how I see it. You didn't know I saw it this way,
Right. Right.
What
Right.
so anyways,
Yeah,
let
I mean,
me
I think
boil that down.
yeah,
I was just gonna say I love what you're doing. How do we
thank
do
you.
that better? And do you think that we aren't doing a very good job in general at teaching our kids how to have these conversations?
Yeah, so there okay, so that's a lot there.
I'm sorry.
Yeah,
Unpack that.
um, there I think we are not doing a good job. I think we're doing a horrible job, actually. I think in higher education, and I've been at the University of Illinois for my entire career, so I can't. But it is a large state institution. Um, we're the flagship campus for the University of Illinois, so um, I do think we're doing a terrible job. And it's not just how to have these conversations, it's almost a way of thinking about things. And I've written about
Right.
critical thinking and all of these other things, and we're not, and part of that, part of it, I mean, part of it is the instructors, right? So there's a piece of it where we have instructors who don't really want to approach, who have, for their own hesitation, for their own reasons, are hesitant sometimes, well intentioned but hesitant to approach issues this way. But I think what ends up happening is that there are two groups of students. So you could say, for example, I'm in the sociology department at the University of Illinois. You know, we have, I don't know what our majors are. We have 200 and something majors or whatever. But the way that social problems, inequalities, issues around identity are discussed in my department, for example, or my discipline, I should say, is not unique to sociology, right? Like there are other disciplines, other, area and ethnic studies, and I'm not saying these things are these departments are bad, but I'm just saying there is somewhat of a shared approach to a lot of these issues, and so you're not just talking about students who major in these. This is my point. You're talking about, every institute of higher education has general education requirements. And so you have a vast number of students who are moving through these classes. And so what I've seen is that there are, I'm going to generalize, there are two kinds of people in the world, one who thinks that there are two kinds of people in the world and the other one who whatever, anyway, however that goes. But I'm going to generalize here, which is that there's two groups of students that move through in the sense of what we're doing. One is a subset of students who moves through these classes and is, for their own political orientations and their intuitions, they're inclined to be in agreement with it, right? Like they agree with the way that the primacy of identity is in terms of thinking about race and all of this, all that goes hand in hand with that. And so their own political orientation is that they agree with it. Again, my goal in the class and just in general is I'm not trying to change people's politics. Like I don't care. Sort of just do you, but whatever, it's your issue. But they're inclined to agree with it, and then they move through the system, or they move through their educational experience, and they, without encountering any framework, tools, or language, how to think about people who don't see things that way, right? And so then we send them off you go into the world. And then there's a second group that, for their own intuitions, their own political orientation or whatever, they're sort of doing a little bit of head scratching, like, I'm not sure, this doesn't really resonate with me, this isn't how I think about my own identity, I'm not sure the intent shouldn't matter, like, And those students, we've also given them no tools, framework, or language to understand or articulate their own intuitions or thoughts on it. And then we send them off into the world. So off you go. And we just, both of these groups are just, it's a disservice to both of them, really, and to people that are going to have to interact with one another out in the world outside of the walls of campus. And so when you ask the question, are we doing this well? I don't, there's, I mean, there's no. And to be clear, like, I don't think, I'm not beating the drum of this is, left wing indoctrination, or this is, we should burn down all, ethnic studies. I don't think any of that is true. I just think that there needs to be a different way of approaching this so that we're preparing students and in giving them tools that we're not currently giving them. I don't know if that makes sense.
It makes perfect sense. Well, it's exactly what you're doing, which is why
Yeah.
I'm loving having this conversation with you, and I'm hoping that more people listen and realize that what you're offering, we need to replicate over and over and over again.
Yeah, that'd be
So,
great. I mean,
yeah,
sure. I mean, my syllabus is online. I'm happy to talk to anyone about the class or whatever. So,
absolutely. Well,
yeah.
I'm almost done with my drink. Is there anything else, any more words of wisdom of how we should be walking in community together in this world, and from what you've seen and how you're teaching and your experiences in this kind of training?
Everything that I can say to respond to that almost sounds too cliche in the sense like, but it's really true. Like, there has to be some, okay, so in a workplace, I would say there has to be some overarching goal, that something that people, get all the boats pointed in the same direction. For at a societal level, and this is the real cliche, we are all in this together. Like, we're going to have to figure, no one is served well when we can't have conversations about, you know whatever the social problem is, whether it's, poverty or education or immigration, when we can't have those conversations because, if I say, actually, I think we should have, these border restrictions or whatever, and somebody says, you're just saying that because you don't want black and brown people in this country. Okay, well, wait, I don't, and I'm not endorsing or condemning that
Right,
position,
right,
but
right.
um that's, it's just, where are you gonna go from there? And so that's, I guess, what I don't know, so that's what I would say.
Yeah, well, again, it all starts with that courage in the classroom, and I
Right.
think that you've got a courageous classroom there. That again,
And
I hope
students.
that we. Well, send me your resume, your resume. Send me your syllabus. You
Yeah,
can send me your
it's on
resume
my
too,
website.
whatever.
I'll send it to you
Okay,
in a
yeah,
second.
and I'll put that up on the website as well.
Sure, of course.
Mm.
Thanks so
Well, thank
much.
you so much. Have a wonderful day and
No
happy
problem. Have a good
Thanksgiving.
Thanksgiving. Yes, and I'll send that to you.
All right,
Bye.
Ilana, thank you.
Bye.
Bye. Thank you for listening to this episode of Hold My Drink. Like or subscribe to the show and check out the show notes for links to source material and to our website where you can find what each of us is reading every week, different news with different views. If you have a topic that you would like us to explore, drop us a line. And join us next week as we say, hold my drink, and the conversation gets real.